That is an unapproved alteration to the community's visual landscape, Mr. Richardson. Her voice was a finely honed weapon, sharpened on a whetstone of perpetual indignation. It sliced through the crisp October air, a discordant note in the symphony of rustling leaves and the distant caw of a crow. I didn't even turn around at first. I was carefully, methodically, inspecting a graft on a gnarled old apple tree, a variety called a black gilliflower that I'd been nursing back to health for 2 seasons. "I'm sorry," I said, finally straightening up and turning to face her. "I must have misheard you. It sounded like you were talking about my trees." Brenda McLeod, president of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association, stood on the perfectly manicured edge of her own lawn, her hands planted firmly on her hips. She was a woman who looked like she gargled with vinegar and found it too sweet. Her blonde hair was shellacked into a helmet of improbable architecture, and her eyes, small and hard, swept over my property with an expression of profound disapproval. My property, the one with the 100-year-old stone wall clearly marking the boundary between my land and her precious HOA kingdom. "I am talking about your orchard." She spat the word like it was a piece of rotten fruit. "It's unsightly. It's not uniform. We have standards in Oak Haven Estates. We have covenants." I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves fill my lungs. It was a scent I had come to associate with peace, a peace that was, at this moment, under direct assault. I am, by nature and by training, a patient man. 30 years as a colonel in the Army Corps of Engineers teaches you a few things. It teaches you that the foundation is everything. It teaches you that you measure 3 times before you cut once. And it teaches you that you never, ever engage in opposing force without understanding the terrain. "Brenda," I began, my voice calm and even, a parade ground tone I hadn't used in years. "We've been over this. My property is not, nor has it ever been, part of the Oak Haven Estates HOA. The deed is a matter of public record. The original plat map for this entire county shows my 10 acres as a carve-out, grandfathered in decades before your development was even a blueprint." She waved a dismissive hand, a gesture that managed to be both imperious and shaky. "Details, details. Your property adjoins ours. It affects our property values. That orchard is a mess of tangled, dead-looking branches. It's an eyesore. You need to have them removed and replaced with something more appropriate. Perhaps some nice, ornamental pear trees. The approved variety, of course." I glanced back at the black gilliflower. Its bark was scarred and ancient, but new growth, green and vibrant, sprouted from its limbs. This tree had likely been planted before her grandparents were born. It had survived droughts, blights, and ice storms. It was a living piece of history, and she wanted to replace it with a soulless, cookie-cutter clone from a big-box garden center. "These are not just trees, Brenda," I explained, deciding to try logic one last time. "This is a heritage apple orchard. Some of these varieties are nearly extinct. They are part of this region's agricultural history. Removing them would be like tearing down a historic landmark." She actually, a wet, porcine sound of derision. "Oh, please, don't be so dramatic. They're weeds, overgrown, ugly weeds. I have the HOA bylaws right here." She brandished a sheaf of papers, her weapon of choice. "Article 9, Section 4. All properties visible from common areas must maintain a neat and uniform appearance, consistent with the aesthetic standards set forth by the Architectural Review Committee." "I'll say it again, slower this time," I said, the parade ground voice getting a little firmer. "My property is not part of the HOA. Your bylaws have as much jurisdiction over my trees as they do over the moon." This, I can see now, was a tactical error. I had presented a fact. To a person like Brenda McLeod, facts are not building blocks of understanding. They are personal insults. Her face, already pinched, tightened into a crimson mask. I am the president of this homeowners association. I am responsible for maintaining the value and integrity of this community, and I will not have it undermined by your historical horticultural nonsense. The volume was rising. I saw a curtain twitch in the house across the street. A tactical commander assesses the battlefield. My battlefield was now attracting civilian attention. You will receive a formal notice of violation, she shrieked, stabbing a finger in my direction. You have 30 days to bring your property into compliance. After that, it's a $500 a day fine until the matter is resolved. We will place a lien on your property. We will foreclose. We will see you out of this neighborhood. She stood there, panting slightly, flushed with the righteousness of her own imagined authority. The threat hung in the air between us, smelling of ozone and petty tyranny. I just looked at her. I didn't say a word. I let her pronouncement echo in the quiet afternoon. A lien, foreclosure, over trees that weren't on her land, fines for rules that didn't apply to me. It was absurd. It was illegal. It was, in its own small, pathetic way, a declaration of war. And as I stood there, a profound and familiar calm settled over me. It was the same feeling I used to get in a stuffy command tent, looking at satellite images of a contested valley or a poorly constructed dam. The initial chaos of the problem would fade, replaced by the quiet, cold hum of strategic analysis. The anger, the disbelief, it all receded. In its place, a mission objective began to form, clear and precise. This woman, this petty tyrant of the cul-de-sac, had just made a critical mistake. She had mistaken my desire for peace for weakness. She had trespassed on my land, not with her feet, but with her ambition, and she had threatened my sanctuary. I gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod, not of agreement, of acknowledgement. She took it as submission. A smug, triumphant little smile played on her lips. She gave a sharp, satisfied sniff, turned on her heel, and marched back across her chemically green lawn, a conquering general returning from a successful skirmish. I watched her go. I looked back at my gnarled, beautiful, historic trees. The war had begun, and I was going to win it. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board member who thinks their three-ring binder of rules is a sacred text, then you are absolutely in the right place. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now, because you're going to want to see how this one ends. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your own HOA nightmare story is. I read every single one. Now let me tell you how this all started. It wasn't with a fight, it was with a search for the exact opposite. After 3 decades in the Army Corps of Engineers, designing, building, and sometimes deconstructing things all over the world, all I wanted was quiet. I'd had enough of command structures, of deadlines, of high-stakes logistics. I'd had enough of living out of a footlocker in places where the ambient temperature could cook an egg on the sidewalk. My retirement wasn't just a cessation of work, it was a strategic retreat to a prepared position of profound tranquility. My wife, bless her, had passed a few years before, and the big house in Virginia felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life already lived. So, I sold it. I put everything in storage and spent the better part of a year driving through the country, looking for the right place. I wasn't looking for a house, I was looking for a sanctuary. I had a list of non-negotiable criteria, the kind of checklist an engineer makes. It had to have land, at least 5 acres. It had to have mature trees. It had to have water, a creek, a pond, something. And most importantly, it had to have no entanglements, no shared driveways, no complex easements, and absolutely, positively, no homeowners association. I finally found it tucked away in a corner of a state known for its rolling hills and agricultural heritage. It was 10 acres of land attached to a small, sturdy-looking stone and cedar house built in the 1950s. The property was an odd rectangle, a remnant of an old farm that had been sold off piece by piece over the decades. The newest piece, sold in the late 90s, had become the Oak Haven Estates, a sprawling development of McMansions with identical landscaping and an air of sterile conformity. My 10 acres were an island, completely surrounded by the development, but legally distinct. Before I even made an offer, I spent a week at the county records office. I'm a man who believes in primary source documents. I pulled the original survey maps. I read the master deed for Oak Haven Estates. I traced the lineage of my parcel, Lot 7 of the old Abernathy farm, back to the 1880s. The documents were unequivocal. Lot 7 was explicitly excluded from the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the Oak Haven development. I had my lawyer, a sharp fellow I'd served with, review my findings. He confirmed it. "Jim," he'd said, "you could paint your house purple and raise goats on the front lawn. They can't touch you." Famous last words. The land was perfect. A small, spring-fed creek cut through the back corner. A thick stand of old-growth oaks and hickories provided a deep, quiet shade. And on a gentle slope facing south, almost completely hidden from the road and the neighboring houses, was the orchard. The first time I walked through it, I knew I was home. It was neglected, sure. The trees were overgrown, choked with vines and suckers. But they were alive. They were fighters. I recognized the shapes of the trunks, the texture of the bark. These weren't modern dwarf trees bred for mass production. These were old-timers. Standard, full-size trees, their branches reaching for the sky like gnarled arms. I spent that first winter just clearing the undergrowth, carefully pruning away the deadwood. It was like an archaeological dig. With each vine I cut, each dead branch I sawed away, the history of the place revealed itself. I found old metal tags nailed to some of the trunks, the names so faded they were almost illegible. With a magnifying glass and some careful rubbing, I made them out. Aesopus Spitzenberg, Newtown Pippin, Roxbury Russet. These were names that sent a little thrill through me. These were heritage apples. Thomas Jefferson's favorite, the apple that was America's first major export. An apple so tough and ugly its nickname was the leather coat. Each tree was a piece of living history, a genetic repository of a bygone era. My retirement project had just found its mission. I wasn't just going to live here. I was going to be a custodian, a steward. The first year was about triage. The second was about restoration. I took grafting courses at the local agricultural extension. I learned about rootstocks in scion wood. I spent my days in the quiet company of those trees, feeling a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since I was designing critical infrastructure overseas. This was my peace, my quiet corner of the world. I was vaguely aware of the HOA next door. I'd see their matching mailboxes and their identical, perfectly manicured lawns. I'd occasionally get their newsletter by mistake, full of passive-aggressive reminders about trash can placement and the approved shades of beige for trim paint. It was a different world, one I had specifically and intentionally bought my way out of. And then came Brenda McLeod. She was elected HOA president about a year after I moved in, on a platform, I later learned, of restoring standards. Her first act was to measure the height of everyone's grass with a ruler. My immediate neighbors, the Garcias, were a young family with 2 small kids. They got a violation notice because their son's plastic slide was an unapproved permanent structure. That should have been my warning. A new commander was on the field, and she was an absolutist. My first direct interaction with her was polite enough. She'd stopped her luxury SUV while I was out by my mailbox. She introduced herself, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. She made some comment about how wild my property looked compared to the rest of the neighborhood. I politely explained that was the point, that I preferred a natural landscape. She'd given me a tight little nod and driven off. I didn't think much of it. It was just a reconnaissance probe. I had failed to recognize it for what it was. The next phase was the confrontation I already described. Her declaration of war over my apple trees. I knew then that my quiet retirement was officially over. A part of me, a part I thought I had buried deep, was almost grimly pleased. The engineer, the strategist, the colonel, he had a new mission. The first official salvo arrived 3 days after our verbal confrontation. It came not in a standard envelope, but in a thick, cream-colored one made of heavy cardstock. In the top left corner, embossed in gold foil, was the Oak Haven Estates logo, a single, perfectly symmetrical oak leaf. It was designed to look official, important, and intimidating. I opened it with the letter opener my staff had given me upon my retirement. It was a miniature replica of a Roman gladius. It seemed appropriate. The letter itself was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive bureaucracy. It was printed on the same heavy cardstock in a severe serif font. Dear property owner at 112 Abernathy Lane. It began, not even deigning to use my name. This letter serves as a formal notice of violation regarding the property located at the aforementioned address. An inspection by the Oak Haven Estates Architectural Review Committee on date has identified a significant breach of community covenants. The letter went on to cite the same Article 9, Section 4 she had screeched at me. It described my heritage orchard as an unmanaged and aesthetically discordant collection of woody growth. It claimed the trees were a potential vector for pests and disease that could threaten the carefully curated ornamental plantings of the community. And then, the payload. Pursuant to the HOA governing documents, you are hereby assessed an initial fine of $500. You have 30 days from the date of this letter to fully remediate the violation. Remediation, in this case, requires the complete removal of the non-compliant trees and submission of a new landscaping plan for committee approval. Failure to comply will result in a recurring fine of $500 per day until the property is brought into compliance. It was signed in a spiky, aggressive script, Brenda McLeod, President, Oak Haven Estates, HOA. I read the letter twice. I didn't feel anger. Anger is a hot, messy emotion. What I felt was cold and sharp. It was the feeling of an equation clicking into place. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated act of aggression. She had put her threat in writing. She had created a paper trail. Good. I believe in paper trails. That afternoon, I didn't go out to the orchard. I went to my office. I pulled out a new 3-inch D-ring binder from the supply closet. It was a heavy-duty one, the kind we use for project specifications on a dam or a bridge. On the spine, I printed a label in neat block letters, Operation Orchard Freedom. This was no longer a spat with a neighbor. This was an operation. And every operation needs a headquarters, a strategy, and meticulous documentation. The first thing that went into the binder was her letter. I placed it in a clear plastic sleeve. I then created a cover sheet. On it, I logged the date the letter was received, the nature of the communication, formal violation notice, the sender, Brenda McLeod, HOA President, and the core allegation, unapproved landscaping, heritage orchard. I cross-referenced the bylaw she cited. I added a section for status and wrote, pending formal rebuttal. My response had to be as methodical as her attack was emotional. It had to be unassailable. It had to be a fortress of facts. I spent the next 2 days drafting my reply. It was not a letter written in anger. It was a legal and historical briefing. I started by politely acknowledging receipt of her letter. Then, point by point, I dismantled her entire premise. Point 1, jurisdiction. I cited the specific book and page number of the county deed records that established my property's legal independence from the Oak Haven Estates HOA. I included a high-resolution copy of the relevant section of the plat map, with my property clearly outlined in red. I highlighted the clause in the HOA's own master deed that explicitly excluded my parcel. Point 2. The trees themselves. I corrected her description of them as woody growth. I listed each heritage variety present in the orchard. I included a brief history of each one, noting its significance to American agriculture. I formally declared the orchard a private historical preservation project. Point 3. The pest and disease accusation. I noted that I worked closely with our county's agricultural extension agent and followed integrated pest management, IPM, protocols, which are far more environmentally sound than the blanket chemical spraying I'd seen the HOA's landscape contractors perform. I stated that my trees were healthier than most of the approved ornamental pears in her development, many of which were suffering from fire blight. Point 4. The fines. I stated clearly and without inflammatory language that since my property was not subject to the HOA's covenants, any attempt to levy fines was legally baseless and constituted harassment. I formally requested that she and the HOA board cease and desist all such attempts. The entire document was polite, firm, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was a statement of facts, supported by evidence. I printed 3 copies, one for my binder, one for me, and one for her. I didn't just drop it in the mail. I drove to the post office and sent it via certified mail, with return receipt requested. That little green card, when it came back with her signature on it, would be irrefutable proof that she had received and read my rebuttal. It would be the next document to go into the binder. For a week there was silence. I almost allowed myself to think that my methodical, overwhelming presentation of facts had worked, that she had read it, consulted someone with a modicum of sense, and decided to retreat. I should have known better. You don't reason with a zealot. The second letter arrived 10 days later. Same cream-colored envelope, same embossed logo. This one was shorter. Dear property owner, we are in receipt of your correspondence. Your arguments have been reviewed by the board and found to be without merit. The aesthetic integrity of the community is paramount. Your appeal is denied. This notice serves to inform you that the 30-day compliance window is still in effect. Your fine for non-compliance remains at $500. Please be advised that an additional fine of $1,000 has been levied for your failure to acknowledge the Architectural Review Committee. Sincerely, Brenda McLeod, President, Oak Haven Estates, HOA. I read it, and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. This was beautiful. This was perfect. She had received my evidence-backed rebuttal. The certified mail receipt had arrived 2 days prior, and her response was to ignore the evidence, reject the facts, and invent a new, even more ludicrous fine. She wasn't just building a case against me anymore. She was building my case against her. I 3-hole punched the letter and the signed certified mail receipt. I slid them into a new plastic sleeve and clipped it into the binder right behind my rebuttal. On my log sheet, I updated the status. Rebuttal ignored. Fines escalated. Harassment continuing. The binder was getting heavier. This was no longer just about defense. It was time to go on the offensive. Operation Orchard Freedom was moving into its next phase, reconnaissance and strategic engagement. My binder was no longer just a defensive file. It was becoming an operational plan. The enemy had rejected a diplomatic solution and escalated hostilities. Standard procedure dictates that you now escalate your own intelligence gathering and seek out superior firepower. In civilian terms, that meant digging deeper into the law and finding bigger dogs to bring to the fight. My first theater of operations was the county's Department of Agriculture. I knew from my initial research that our state had right-to-farm laws, but I needed to understand their specific application. I made an appointment with a man named Dale Peterson, the county's senior agricultural extension agent. Dale was exactly the kind of public servant you hope to find. He was in his late 60s, with hands like worn leather gloves and a face mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 summer suns. His office was a chaotic jumble of soil maps, seed catalogs, and strange-looking farm implements. He listened patiently as I laid out my situation, my binder open on his desk between us. I didn't present it as a complaint. I presented it as a request for information. I watched his face as he read Brenda's letters. His eyebrows, bushy and gray, climbed higher and higher up his forehead. When he got to the part about my orchard being a potential vector for pests, he let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. "Colonel," he said, pushing his glasses up his nose, "I know this orchard, or at least I know of it. Old Man Abernathy was a legend. He collected apple varieties the way some folks collect stamps. The fact that you're bringing it back, well, that's not just a hobby, son. That's a public service." That one sentence felt like a battlefield promotion. "So this HOA," he tapped Brenda's letter with a thick finger, "they want you to cut down a living historical archive to plant some cookie-cutter Bradford pears that'll just split in half in the first ice storm?" "That's the tactical summary, yes," I replied. "Well, they're not just wrong, they're stupid," Dale said, leaning back in his creaky chair. "But more importantly, they're about to be on the wrong side of the state agricultural board." This was the moment, the discovery of a critical vulnerability in the enemy's position. He explained that the state had recently passed a rider to its agricultural preservation laws, specifically aimed at protecting heritage and heirloom varietals. Because I had documented the specific rare types of apples on my property, and because I was actively working to preserve them, my orchard could be officially registered with the state. "Once it's registered," Dale said with a grin, "it's not just your private orchard anymore. It's a recognized historical agricultural site. Messing with it isn't just a property dispute, it's a violation of state code. The fines for that make $500 a day look like pocket change." He pushed a stack of forms across the desk. "Fill these out. I'll personally inspect your property next week to verify the varieties. I'll co-sign the application and fast-track it with my contacts at the state capitol. This HOA president of yours has picked a fight with the wrong patch of dirt." I felt a surge of pure, cold satisfaction. This was the legal equivalent of an airstrike. I wasn't just defending my trench anymore. I was calling in overwhelming firepower from a higher authority. While the paperwork was being processed, Dale provided me with a formal letter on Department of Agriculture letterhead. It stated that my orchard was under review for formal state protection, and that any action taken to alter or remove the trees would be viewed as a potential violation of state environmental and agricultural codes. Another document for the binder, a beautiful, powerful document. The next phase of reconnaissance was to understand the human terrain. An army is only as strong as its morale. I suspected the morale in Oak Haven Estates was low. Brenda was a classic tyrant. Tyrants rule by fear, and fear breeds resentment. It was time to see if I could find some allies. I started with the Garcias, my immediate neighbors. I saw Maria Garcia in her front yard one afternoon, miserably trying to camouflage her son's brightly colored slide with a drab brown tarp. It was a pathetic sight. "Having some trouble?" I asked, leaning on the stone wall that separated our worlds. She jumped, startled. "Oh, Colonel Richardson. Yes, we got another notice. The slide is still visible from the street. Brenda says if we don't fully mitigate its visual impact, she's going to start fining us." Her voice was full of a weary frustration that I was beginning to know well. "That seems unreasonable," I said carefully. That was all it took. The dam of her frustration broke. She told me about the endless stream of petty violations. Their basketball hoop had to be taken down every single night. Their daughter's chalk drawings on the driveway were a graffiti violation. They were cited because their garden hose wasn't coiled in a perfectly circular fashion. It's like living in a prison camp, she whispered, looking around nervously as if Brenda might materialize from the bushes. We want to move, but who would buy a house with this woman in charge? Everyone's afraid of her. I'm not, I said quietly. I told her about my own battle. I didn't show her the binder, not yet. That was my ace in the hole. But I told her about the fines, the threats, and the illegal nature of Brenda's demands. I saw a spark of something in her eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was camaraderie, the shared misery of the oppressed. She's having an emergency community meeting in 2 weeks, Maria said. Something about a budget shortfall. Everyone has to go. She's probably just going to yell at us all for an hour. I'll be there, I said, and I'll be bringing a guest. My next stop was Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who lived down the street. I'd seen her talking to the birds she fed from a line of feeders in her backyard. I found her on her porch, looking sadly at a bare metal pole. She made you take them down? I asked gently. Mrs. Gable nodded, her eyes welling up. She said they attract vermin, squirrels and chipmunks, said it was a health code violation. Those birds were my only company some days. I listened to her story. I listened to the story of the family who was fined because their satellite dish was 2 inches out of alignment. I listened to the story of the man who was forced to repaint his front door because the approved shade of forest green had been discontinued by the board. For each one, I took careful, dispassionate notes on a fresh sheet of paper in the back of my binder. Name, address, nature of harassment, dates, fine amounts. The evidence was piling up. Brenda wasn't just a tyrant. She was a serial abuser of power, and her victims were all around me. They were isolated and afraid. It was time to unite them. The final piece of the puzzle fell into my lap by pure chance, or perhaps by the universe rewarding good preparation. I was at a local coffee shop reviewing my notes when a man approached my table. He was a nervous-looking fellow in his 50s, with glasses that were perpetually sliding down his nose. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low. "You're Colonel Richardson, right? The fellow with the old orchard?" I admitted I was. "My name is Frank Miller," he said, sliding into the opposite chair. "I used to be the treasurer for the Oak Haven HOA. Used to be. The 2 most beautiful words I'd heard all week. I resigned 3 months ago," he continued, wringing his hands. "I couldn't take it anymore. Brenda, she's out of control." Frank was the inside source every field commander dreams of, a disillusioned defector with access to critical intelligence. He told me that Brenda ruled the board with an iron fist. The other 2 members, a pair of sycophants I mentally dubbed the cronies, just rubber-stamped everything she did. "She's spending money like it's water," Frank whispered, leaning in conspiratorially. "We have a massive budget shortfall, and it's because she's pouring HOA funds into her personal vendettas. Legal consultations, administrative fees, it's a disaster." "Legal consultations?" I asked, my senses sharpening. "Yeah," Frank said. "She's been paying a high-priced law firm, thousands of dollars. I tried to tell her that the HOA's lawyer is only for collecting dues and enforcing legitimate covenant violations, not for pursuing personal grudges against non-members. She told me I didn't understand fiduciary duty and overruled me. My mind raced. She was using community funds to harass me, an individual outside her jurisdiction. That wasn't just mismanagement, that was malfeasance, potentially embezzlement. "Frank," I said, my voice low and steady, "do you have any documentation to support this?" He bit his lip, then seemed to come to a decision. "I made copies," he said, "before I resigned. I knew this day would come. I have the quarterly budget reports, the invoices from the law firm, the minutes from the meetings where I objected and was overruled. It's all there." I felt a feeling that can only be described as tactical ecstasy. This was the kill shot, the smoking gun, the financial evidence that would turn her own community against her. "Frank," I said, closing my binder, "I think you and I need to coordinate our efforts." The coffee shop meeting was a strategic windfall. Frank Miller's defection and the promise of financial documents shifted the entire operational landscape. My binder, which had started as a defense dossier, was now transforming into a prosecution case file. It was time to bring in my own legal firepower. I called Marcus Thorne. Marcus had been a captain in the JAG Corps when I was a lieutenant colonel. We'd worked together on a few complex contract disputes in Germany. He was sharp, aggressive, and had a theatrical flair that I knew would be useful. After retiring from the Army, he'd opened a private practice specializing in, as he put it, unraveling bureaucratic knots with extreme prejudice. We met in his office, a space of mahogany and leather that smelled of old books in Victory. I didn't give him a verbal summary. I simply placed Operation Orchard Freedom on his polished desk. It was now nearly 4 inches thick. "What's this, Jim?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. "Your memoirs?" "Opposition research," I replied, "field prepped." He flipped it open. He started at the beginning with Brenda's first violation letter. He read my certified rebuttal. He saw her dismissive, escalating response. He spent a long time looking at the high-resolution plat map and the highlighted sections of the county deeds. He examined the letter from Dale at the Department of Agriculture. He read my documented interviews with the Garcias and Mrs. Gable. He was silent for the better part of an hour, his face growing more and more grimly delighted. Every so often, he would let out a low whistle or a quiet, "Oh, she's a beauty." Finally, he got to the last section, my notes from the meeting with Frank Miller and the promise of financial records. He closed the binder with a soft, definitive thud. He looked at me, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Jim, my friend," he said, leaning back and steepling his fingers, "this isn't a defense. This is a kill box. You've built a perfect 360-degree kill box of evidence, and this woman has walked right into the middle of it and is doing jumping jacks." He stood up and began to pace, the old courtroom predator instincts kicking in. "This is a prosecutor's dream. We have harassment of a non-member. We have illegal fines. We have a violation of state agricultural code. And now, thanks to your man Frank, we have potential misuse of funds, breach of fiduciary duty, and possibly criminal fraud. So what's our next move?" I asked. "We wait," Marcus said, a glint in his eye. "Tyrants like this always overplay their hand. She's frustrated. You've defied her. You've rebutted her with facts she can't comprehend. She's going to do something stupid, something physical and irreversible. We just need to be ready to document it when she does." He was right. 2 days later, Frank called me in a panic. He had heard from a friend still on the inside that Brenda had pushed a vote through at an emergency board meeting. Just her and her 2 cronies. They had approved an emergency expenditure to hire a landscaping company to abate the nuisance on my property. They were going to trespass and cut down my trees. This was it, the critical error. The antagonist's lunge across the line that separates threats from action. The morning they were scheduled to arrive, I was ready. I had my phone set up on a tripod, discreetly aimed at the property line from my office window, recording everything. I had a portable, high-volume Bluetooth speaker ready to go, and I had the binder under my arm. At 9 a.m. sharp, a large truck from A1 Affordable Tree Service rumbled down the street and parked in front of my property. 2 men in dirty jeans and t-shirts got out, chainsaws in hand. They were led by a foreman who unrolled a work order and pointed confidently at my orchard. They didn't even hesitate. They walked right past the stone wall, trespassing onto my land. I let them get about 20 feet in. I let the foreman spray paint a large orange X on the trunk of my prized Aesopus Spitzenberg. Then I made my move. I didn't run out yelling. I walked out calmly, binder in hand. "Good morning, gentlemen. I said, my voice perfectly level. The foreman looked up, startled. You, Richardson? We're here to take down these trees. Got a work order from the HOA. I'm sure you do, I said, but I'm afraid there's been a significant misunderstanding. First, I need to inform you that you are currently trespassing on private property. The foreman scoffed. Lady said this was all part of the neighborhood commons. The lady was incorrect, I said. I opened the binder to the plat map, showing him the clearly marked boundary. This is my property, not the HOA's. He looked confused. Well, she's paying for it. Which brings me to my second point, I continued, flipping to the letter from the Department of Agriculture. This orchard is a registered state historical site. The tree you just marked for destruction is a protected heritage variety. Cutting it down is a violation of State Agricultural Code 11-3A. The fine for that starts at $10,000 per tree, and it's levied against the party doing the cutting. That would be you. The color drained from his face. The other two workers, who had been revving their chainsaws, let them die with a sputter. And finally, I said, my voice dropping slightly, I need to inform all three of you that this entire interaction, starting from the moment your truck parked, is being recorded in high-definition video and audio. My lawyer has your company name and your truck's license plate. If so much as a single leaf is harmed on these trees, he is instructed to file a civil suit for damages and trespassing and to forward the evidence to the state attorney's office to pursue criminal charges. I let that hang in the air. The only sound was the chirping of birds. The foreman looked from my face to the binder to the orange X on the tree and back to my face. He saw no anger, no bluffing. He saw only calm, immovable fact. We need to make a call, he stammered. He walked back to his truck, pulling out his phone. I heard snippets of the conversation. Yeah, the guy's out here, says it's his land, something about the state. Yeah, he's got a binder full of, I don't know, lawyer stuff. No, I'm not cutting a damn thing until you sort this out. You want to pay a $10,000 fine, you come cut it yourself. He hung up the phone, his face a mixture of fury and relief. Right, we're out of here. He and his men packed up their gear, got in their truck, and sped away without a backward glance. I walked over to the Asopus Spitzenberg and gently wiped the orange paint from its bark. The standoff was over. The counter-offensive had been a complete success. That afternoon, I edited the video of the confrontation. I made it short and to the point. Then I sent it to Maria Garcia. I think you and the other neighbors should see this, I wrote. This is what happens when you stand up to her. The effect was immediate and electric. The video spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The sight of Brenda's hired muscle being turned back at the border by calm, documented facts was a revelation. Fear began to curdle into outrage. People who had been afraid to even speak her name were now furiously texting each other, sharing their own stories of harassment. My small resistance cell was about to become a full-blown rebellion. 2 days later, Frank Miller hand-delivered a thick manila envelope to my door. It's all in there, he said, a new confidence in his voice. The invoices, the budgets, the meeting minutes. Go get her, Colonel. I opened the envelope. It was even better than I had hoped. Invoices from a high-priced law firm explicitly billing for consultation regarding non-compliant adjacent property. Catered board meeting receipts from fancy restaurants for just Brenda and her two cronies. It was a clear, undeniable pattern of treating the HOA's treasury as her personal war chest. The emergency community meeting was in 1 week. My kill box was now complete. All the pieces were on the board. The final phase of the operation was about to begin, the public coup. The night of the emergency community meeting, the air in the Oak Haven Estates Community Center was thick with a tension you could cut with a knife. It was a sterile, beige room, usually reserved for potlucks and children's birthday parties. Tonight it felt like a courtroom on the eve of a verdict. The place was packed, standing room only. I saw faces I recognized from my reconnaissance. The Garcias, sitting near the front, looking nervous but determined. Mrs. Gable, flanked by her two grown sons, her expression grim. Frank Miller near the back giving me a subtle, encouraging nod. This wasn't Brenda's usual audience of cowed and compliant residents. This was a crowd that had seen the video. A crowd that had been whispering in driveways and over fences for a week. This was a crowd that was ready for a change. At the front of the room, behind a folding table draped with a cheap polyester tablecloth, sat the triumvirate. Brenda McLeod in the center, flanked by her two board members, a man and a woman who looked like they'd been chosen for their ability to nod in unison. Brenda banged a small wooden gavel, the sounds sharp and impotent in the charged atmosphere. This emergency meeting of the Oak Haven Estates Homeowners Association will now come to order, she announced, her voice straining for an authority it no longer possessed. The first item on our agenda is a necessary special assessment to cover an unforeseen budget shortfall. She launched into a prepared speech, full of jargon about fiduciary responsibility and unexpected legal expenditures. She was trying to frame her profligate spending as a necessary defense of the community. The crowd was not buying it. A low murmur of dissent was already starting to build. Marcus Thorne, my lawyer, had coached me on the timing. Let her dig the hole a little deeper, he'd said. Let her commit to her narrative in front of everyone. Then you pull the rug out. After about 10 minutes of her prevarication, I stood up. I had positioned myself in the center aisle, about halfway back. I didn't have to shout. My simple act of rising was enough to make her stop mid-sentence. Every eye in the room swiveled to me. "Excuse me, Madam President," I said, my voice calm and carrying easily in the sudden silence. "Before we discuss any special assessments, I believe the community has a right to understand the nature of these unexpected legal expenditures." Brenda's face flushed. "You are not a member of this association, Mr. Richardson. You have no standing to speak at this meeting." "On the contrary," I replied, taking a step forward, "since it appears a significant portion of the HOA's funds have been spent trying to harass me, I believe I have more standing than anyone. And I'm not here as a non-member. I'm here as an invited guest of several of your members." On cue, Mr. Garcia stood up. "He's my guest." Mrs. Gable stood up. "And mine." Around the room, a dozen other people rose to their feet. "And mine. And mine." It was a coordinated, beautiful moment. The rebellion was declaring itself. Brenda looked from face to face, her composure starting to crack. The cronies looked at their hands, refusing to make eye contact with the crowd. "I have prepared a short presentation," I said, walking calmly to the front of the room. I was carrying my laptop. Frank had arranged for a projector and screen to be set up, under the guise of it being for Brenda's budget presentation. "I believe it will shed some light on the association's financial situation." "This is out of order," Brenda shrieked, banging her gavel again, faster this time. "I will not allow this." "Then you can have the sheriff remove me," I said, turning to face her directly. "But I assure you, and everyone in this room, that the evidence I am about to present is already in the hands of my attorney and will be made public one way or another." Checkmate. She knew she was trapped. Defeated, she sank back into her chair, her face a mask of thunderous fury. I plugged my laptop into the projector. The first image that flashed up on the screen was a high-resolution satellite photo of the neighborhood. On it, a bright red line was drawn around my property. "This," I began, my voice that of a briefer in a command tent, "is the legal boundary of my property, 112 Abernathy Lane, as defined by County Deed Book 481, page 22. As you can see, it is not, and never has been, part of the Oak Haven Estates, HOA." I clicked to the next slide. It was a picture of the first violation letter. "Despite this clear legal fact, on this date, Your HOA president, Brenda McLeod, began a campaign of harassment against me, demanding I destroy a historical apple orchard on my own private land. Click. A photo of my certified mail receipt. My polite, fact-based rebuttal was ignored. Click. A photo of the second letter, the one with the invented fine. Instead, the harassment and illegal fines escalated. The room was dead silent, hanging on every word. I was not yelling. I was not accusing. I was simply presenting an unassailable timeline of documented facts. This campaign culminated, I said, my voice dropping slightly for dramatic effect, in Ms. McLeod using your HOA funds to hire a work crew to illegally trespass on my property and attempt to destroy what is now a state-registered historical agricultural site. Click. The video of the standoff with the tree cutters played on the screen. The entire room watched as the foreman admitted he was hired by the HOA, as I calmly presented the law, and as the crew retreated in defeat. A wave of gasps and angry murmurs swept through the room. Now, at this point, you might be thinking this is just a dispute between Ms. McLeod and myself, I continued, pausing the video. But how many of you have had a similar experience? This was the signal. Mr. Garcia stood up again, his voice shaking but clear. She fined us $200 because our son's playset was the wrong shade of green. We had to paint it taupe. Mrs. Gable's son spoke next, his voice booming with anger. She forced my 78-year-old mother to take down her bird feeders, one of her only joys, claiming they were a vermin hazard. One by one, the people I had spoken to stood up and shared their stories. The basketball hoop, the chalk drawings, the garden hose, the front door. It became a chorus of abuse, a litany of petty cruelties. With each story, the anger in the room grew, a palpable force directed squarely at the folding table at the front. Brenda was shrinking. She tried to interrupt, to bang her gavel, but her voice was lost in the rising tide of discontent. And now, I said, raising my voice to command the room again, let's talk about the budget shortfall. Let's see where your money has been going. This was the kill shot. Click. The first invoice from the law firm appeared on the screen for thousands of dollars. The line item, consultation regarding non-compliant adjacent property, was highlighted in red. Click. Another invoice. And another. Click. The catering receipts for the board meetings at a fancy steakhouse. Dinner for three, $680. Paid for by the HOA. Frank Miller, from the back of the room, provided the narration. I objected to these expenditures, he called out. I told Brenda they were an improper use of funds. She overruled me, and the other board members just sat there. The room erupted. The murmurs became shouts. Thief! Resign! Give us our money back! Brenda finally found her voice, but it wasn't a voice of authority. It was a raw, panicked screech. It was necessary. I was protecting our property values. I was doing my duty. She banged the gavel over and over, a frantic, meaningless rhythm against the roar of the crowd. It was useless. She had lost all control. Her command had collapsed. Her authority had evaporated. Into the chaos, Marcus Thorne, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. He didn't have to shout. He had the natural authority of a man who knew the law was his weapon. "A motion is in order," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. Frank Miller's voice rang out immediately. "I move for a vote of no confidence and the immediate removal of Brenda McLeod and the entire current board of directors." "Seconded," yelled Mr. Garcia. It was all perfectly legal, all according to the HOA's own bylaws for emergency meetings. Brenda looked at Marcus, then at me, her face a mess of disbelief and hatred. She saw a perfectly executed coup. "All in favor of the motion," Marcus yelled. The response was a deafening, cathartic roar. Aye! It was the sound of a community liberating itself. All opposed? Silence. Even the two cronies, seeing which way the wind was blowing, stayed silent, staring at the table, their faces pale. Brenda let out a choked, strangled sob. "The motion carries," Marcus declared. "Brenda McLeod, you are hereby removed from the office of president, effective immediately. Your board is dissolved." For a moment, she just sat there, stunned. The queen had been deposed. Her castle had crumbled. Then, with a final, pathetic shriek of pure rage, she swept her useless gavel and papers off the table, turned, and fled. She didn't walk. She ran, pushing her way through the parting crowd, and burst out the doors into the night, a tyrant stripped of her tin pot kingdom. The humiliation was absolute. The coup was complete. The aftermath of the public coup was swift and decisive. The atmosphere in the community center transformed instantly from one of oppressive tension to one of giddy liberation. In the power vacuum left by Brenda's spectacular implosion, a new order was quickly established. Marcus Thorne, ever the master of procedure, guided the room. "According to the bylaws," he announced, "in the event of a full board removal, an interim board must be elected on the spot to manage the association's affairs until a formal election can be held." Nominations came fast. Frank Miller, the whistleblower treasurer, was nominated by a dozen people at once. He accepted, a look of quiet vindication on his face. Mr. Garcia, the young father who had stood up first, was nominated and accepted. A sharp, no-nonsense accountant named Susan, who had been quietly tracking Brenda's financial shenanigans for months, was the third. They were elected by a unanimous, enthusiastic voice vote. The new interim board's first official act, proposed by Frank just minutes after taking their seats at the front table, was a symbolic and deeply satisfying piece of business. "I move," he said, his voice ringing with newfound authority, "that the Oak Haven Estates HOA formally and publicly apologizes to Colonel James Richardson for the campaign of harassment waged against him. I further move that all fines, violations, and liens issued by the previous board against any resident for aesthetic or non-safety-related issues be declared null and void, effective immediately." The motion was seconded so fast it was almost an echo, and it passed with another roar of approval. It was a collective expunging of the old regime's sins. Mrs. Gable was crying, but this time they were tears of joy. Maria Garcia was hugging her husband. The spell of fear was broken. But my operation wasn't over. Victory isn't just about winning the battle, it's about ensuring the peace. The reckoning for Brenda was just beginning. The following week, Marcus Thorne, acting on behalf of the new HOA board, filed a civil lawsuit against Brenda McLeod. The suit sought to recover the thousands of dollars of HOA funds she had misappropriated for her personal legal vendetta and extravagant meetings. My binder, Operation Orchard Freedom, was entered as Exhibit A. It was so thorough, so meticulously documented, that Brenda's lawyer advised her to settle almost immediately. She was forced to repay every single cent she had wasted. But that was just the financial penalty. The real consequences came from a different quarter. Armed with the financial documents from Frank and the evidence from my binder, Marcus and the new board filed a formal complaint with the county's district attorney's office. An investigation was opened into embezzlement and wire fraud. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but they grind exceedingly fine. 6 months later, Brenda McLeod was indicted by a grand jury. She ended up taking a plea deal to avoid jail time, but the conviction on a felony fraud charge was a permanent stain. The financial and legal pressures were immense. Forced to pay back the HOA and cover her own mounting legal bills, she put her house on the market. It sold quickly, in no small part due to the neighborhood's newfound reputation for being recently liberated. I saw the moving truck pull up one Saturday morning. I watched from my porch as she loaded the last of her boxes, her face pinched in gray. She never once looked in my direction. She drove away from Oak Haven Estates, a disgraced exile, leaving behind a community she had tried to strangle and had instead inadvertently healed. The change in the neighborhood was palpable. The oppressive quiet of fear was replaced by the cheerful noise of a real community. Kids' laughter echoed through the cul-de-sacs. Neighbors who had previously scurried from their cars to their front doors now stopped to chat in their driveways. A community barbecue was organized. Mrs. Gable's backyard was once again a riot of bird feeders, a colorful, fluttering testament to the new era. The Garcias bought a new, even bigger and brighter playset for their kids, and no one said a word. The oppressive beige conformity was slowly being replaced by the vibrant colors of individuality and freedom. I became something of a local legend, the Colonel. People would wave as they drove by. Sometimes a bottle of wine or a freshly baked pie would appear on my doorstep. I always appreciated the gesture, but the greatest reward was something much simpler: the quiet, the peace I had sought from the very beginning. It's autumn again, a few years later. The air is crisp and smells of wood smoke and apples. I'm standing in my orchard, which is now thriving. The black gilliflower and the Asopus Spitzenberg are heavy with fruit, their gnarled branches bowing under the weight of their own history. The creek gurgles softly in the distance. I'm holding a glass of cider, pressed this morning from my own apples. It's sharp, complex, and deeply satisfying. It tastes like victory. I look out over the stone wall towards Oak Haven Estates. The houses are still there, the lawns are still neat, but the spirit is different. It's relaxed, it's alive. I never wanted a fight. I came here for sanctuary, but I learned, or perhaps was simply reminded of, a lesson the Corps taught me long ago. Peace is not a passive state. It's not a gift. Sometimes it is a fortress that must be built, defended, and secured. My binder is still on a shelf in my office, a silent monument to that truth. It's a reminder that the most effective weapons in a war against petty tyranny are not anger or shouting, but cold, hard, documented facts. The moral of the story, I suppose, is that everyone has a right to their own quiet corner of the world, to be left alone to cultivate their garden or their orchard. And if a tyrant tries to take that away, you don't just get mad, you get organized, you build your case, and you dismantle their authority piece by documented piece until all that's left is the sweet, simple taste of hard-won peace.